Welcome back to class, and this is the fifth lesson of Module 3 for the Product Owner Training. And in this lesson, we'll be looking at the second artifact, which we have good understanding of what it is. That is talking about the sprint backlog. In the last lesson, we looked at the product backlog as the first artifact in Scrum from the angle of the product owner. So in this lesson, we would progress from the first to the second Scrum artifact, the sprint backlog. I believe by now we still remember what happens in a sprint, and a sprint is that duration of developing a value for the stakeholders. Scrum runs in sprints. That's why we often talk about iterations. And from the last class, we spoke about the product backlog that has all the work items or the stories to complete a product. Product backlog has a product goal. And we mentioned from the last class that from the product backlog, based on the team's ability and capacity, the team comes around at the sprint planning meeting to pick a set of work items they can complete in a sprint duration. So from the entire product backlog, they would come together and decide which they would pick. Which they would pick as some considerations. And that brings us to the inverse criteria, which we consider. In Module 2, we discussed extensively on what happens in a sprint planning. And we mentioned that the inverse criteria serve as a guide for the sprint planning. So the sprint backlog is the second artifact. Artifact is that tangible, I don't want to use the word physical, but it's that tangible aspects of Scrum, what we can make reference to as regards the work that is being developed. And of course, we have the product backlog, now the sprint backlog. Is that tangible side or the tangible development itself. So the sprint backlog as an artifact in Scrum represents the set of work items that the development team has committed to completing during a specific sprint. We know that the sprint cycle is between 1 to 4 weeks. So the sprint backlog represents the work the development team, those are the developers, as committed to. The work the development team has committed to completing during the cycle of a sprint. Because we have good understanding of that again. So when we look at the board for a moment, this becomes an active sprint. So this is what the team has committed to. Let's assume this is the beginning of a sprint. This is what the team has committed to in this particular sprint. So it is a subset of the product backlog. Of course, we can see from here is a piece or a cut off, a portion of the product backlog that we now decided to deliver in a duration of a sprint, which contains all the work items required to achieve the product vision and goal. The product backlog has the product vision and goal. So the sprint backlog is a portion of it that has the product vision and goal. So when that portion moves here, it would have the sprint goal. The sprint goal is what the team set out to achieve in the course of a sprint. The sprint backlog is created and owned by the development team. Please let's note that. The sprint backlog is owned by the development team. The product backlog is owned by the product owner. Why is the sprint backlog owned by the development team? Because they are the ones to deliver that sprint goal. They are the ones committed to that sprint goal. The product owner is not the developer. He owns what is being developed, but the developers, the ones they've decided to work on in the course of the sprint, will now belong to them to work on. And that is why this informs why we say the daily stand up or the daily scrum belongs to the developers also. They are updating and reviewing their work process day in, day out, right? So the sprint backlog is created and owned by the development team. Of course, we know from the sprint planning that this creation is done by the entire team coming together, led by the product owner. Of course, led by the product owner because he is the one telling them what is next in priority, what the stakeholders want to be delivered soonest. But after the set of work had been picked, the development team would then run with those items themselves. Of course, as we've said over time, they have the Scrum Master with them, supporting and helping them to deliver value. So the sprint backlog is created and owned by the development team with guidance from the product owner and input from the Scrum Master. The product owner is guiding them, telling them what should be developed. Is also bringing clarification to them on what the stakeholders want and how they want it. And the Scrum Master is there to support them, making a flow in Scrum, ensuring that Scrum is adhered to in delivering that particular work. Then the inverse criteria would be the guide for the team at the sprint planning event, which focuses on the sprint backlog. So we could see from here, from the angle of the product owner, the product owner is leading the team, let me use that word, into the sprint planning meeting where he ensures that clarifications are made on each of those stories, ensuring that the developers clearly understand, what they need to do and deliver the right value that would fit in for the stakeholders. So the product owner is that middle gap, communicating the mind of the stakeholders to the team and also ensuring that the sprint is adhered to because that forms a piece of the product goal as well. Before we close this class, let's look at these quick slides. In this first slide, it says warning sign, day one and day two of the sprint. I want you to take a moment to look at what you have on the screen. Why have we said this is a warning sign? In day one and day 2 of the sprints. If you are the product owner and in the course of your daily stand up, you realize that this is what you have on your board, and we're saying this is a warning sign. What makes it a warning sign? Mind you, it has what we call Kaizen there, which is the continuous improvement brought in from the retrospective. So this team appears to be doing well because they've been able to also bring actionable items from their previous sprint retrospective into what will be achieved in the next sprint. But we're saying what we have on the screen is a warning sign. So could you note it down why we say this is a warning sign? All right. And the next one, we say also that this is also a warning sign on the last day of the sprint. So why have we said this also is a warning sign on the last day of the sprint? Mind you, this one also has Kaiser on it. But from what we can see here, we are identifying both to be warning signs. Let's go back to the last one, and I'll quickly explain to us before we close this class why this is a warning sign. It is a warning sign because this is day 1, between day 1 and day 2 of the sprint, and we can see from here that no story is moved in progress at all. There is no story in progress. If one day into your sprint and second day into your sprint, no story had been moved from your board, then it becomes a warning sign. Let's see from the board. Let's say we just committed to this sprint and each developer is to jump over and commit to work. The following day, which is the end of the first day of starting the sprint, you come to your daily stand-up and there's nothing in your to-do progress. That becomes a warning sign because it is either the developers had not started work at all, or the developers are not progressing their cards on the board. Mind you, in Module 2, I lay emphasis on why the developers must update their workflow. That brings transparency to everybody. So where we see that day 1, day 2 of the sprint, nothing is in progress. In actual sense, this story carries a 1 point. On day 1, the story should move here. And whatsoever we tend to call it, by day 2 of the story, a 1 story point should be done. But if your team has nothing on the in progress by day 1, and that same thing happens by day 2, there is fire on your mountain. Just as I mentioned, it's either the developers are not working at all, or that the developers are not progressing their tickets. And that is one of the beauties we have from the daily stand-up. It brings that transparency and we can follow through. We can know when the developers are moving well, and when a story is estimated 1 or 2, we are expecting same to be delivered in that same span. So that is what makes this a warning sign, when in day 1 and day 2 nothing gets to the progress column. All right, and the next one, what makes this a warning sign also? This is the last day of the sprint. On the last day of the sprint, you want to see most of your tickets in the done column. Most of your tickets should have been done with, right? So when you're still having your tickets in progress, that means there is fire on your mountain. and you should do something about it. Let's look at the board again. Let's say we have tomorrow is our sprint, end of sprint. Let's look at all these stories, for instance. All these stories, this is a 1 point story, 1 point story, 2 point story, 3 point story, 1 point story, and a 5 point story. So if anything at all on your 10-day sprint, within a 10-day cycle of a sprint, you should have all these stories in done already. It's either they are moved, the developers had completed it, his or her work, moved to a review, and also the tester, the QA, had also accomplished his or her own task. The product owner also should be working in that flow with the team, looking at what needs to be done, ensuring they are done properly, and moving them to done. So on your last day of the sprint, you should have at least most of your stories in the done column. So it becomes a warning sign when on your last day of the sprint you have nothing to deliver, nothing to write home about. That makes it the warning from your board. So we can see the impacts and the effects of having a transparent workflow pattern and the value it gives the Scrum team. Alright, so that will be all for this class. We would meet again in the next class when we shall be looking at the third Scrum artifact, making reference to the product increment. If you have any questions, please note them down and send them across. I'll be glad to